Hi, my name is Beth, Director of Strategic Communications at the Canada-France-Hawaii Telescope. On this week's episode of MKO at Home, it's all about the moon. We have a blue moon, a harvest moon, a hunter moon, all of these moons this month. But what does that all mean? And how are they different from every other moon every other month? So before we can get into all of those names for the moons we'll see this month, we need to talk a little bit more about the moon and the Earth. So the moon orbits the Earth. Just like the Earth orbits the sun, the moon travels around the Earth. Now, in the case of the moon, one orbit takes 27.3 days. Now, we always see the same side of the moon as it travels around the Earth, as it orbits. That's because of a gravity relationship between the moon and the Earth. Now, when we talk about the phases of the moon, or the fact that every night when we look into the sky, the moon changes and looks a little bit different, we need to add the sun into the story.
Here we have the moon, the Earth, and the sun in their full moon position. The light from the sun reflects and illuminates the entire front surface of the moon, causing those of us on the Earth to be able to see a full moon. A full moon occurs every 29.5 days.
So that's kind of confusing. We go from full moon to full moon every 29.5 days. But earlier I said that it takes 27.3 days for the moon to make one trip around the Earth. What explains that difference? Well, we have to add the Earth and the sun back into the story. So while the moon is orbiting the Earth is orbiting the sun. And so those two motions occur at the same time. Because the Earth is orbiting the sun, it takes a little bit of extra time every month for the moon to get back into a position where it's full. So that explains why it takes a different amount of time for the moon to orbit the Earth as it does for us to go from full moon to full moon. Now, in all of this, I still haven't answered the question about blue moons. Blue moons aren't actually blue. It's an old phrase, a phrase that actually is German in origin, and no one's really quite certain what they were referring to or why they called this phenomenon a blue moon. It was then translated into English. There are two different definitions of a blue moon. The first definition is the older, more traditional one that we see in farmers' almanacs. Now, it takes roughly 1 month to go from full moon to full moon. We have one full moon, roughly, per month, which means 12 full moons per year. If we look at a season, we have 4 seasons, and so each season is basically 3 months long. So in each season, we expect 3 full moons. In that farmer's almanac definition of a blue moon, they call a blue moon the third full moon in a season that has 4. That is not the definition of a blue moon that applies to our October full moon. In 1949, Seaon Telescope, whether intentionally or accidentally, they gave a new definition to a blue moon. They called a blue moon the second full moon in a month. And that's what we're going to see happen in October. So our first full moon was sometime on the night of August 1st. 29.5 days later, we end up with a full moon on Halloween. That's going to be our blue moon this year. Harvest moons and hunter's moons. Again, we need to tackle those questions because you've probably read about them online or seen something in the news about them. Anytime you see an adjective describing the moon, like harvest or hunter, we're going back again to the Farmer's Almanac. So traditionally, farmers' almanacs gave names to each of the moons in the season to kind of help with what's going on in their local community. Often these names are attributed to Native Americans. But these almanacs never are very specific on which Native American tribe or indigenous peoples called the moon by these different names. Native Americans, indigenous people, had very different practices, region to region, tribe to tribe. And so to say all Native Americans called the October moon the hunter moon is really quite misleading. Similarly, the idea that the first full moon after the first day of fall is a harvest moon to Native Americans ignores a lot of Native American practices. So when we're looking at these names, we need to be careful and try to think of the context at which those names came from. So here in Hawaii, the harvest moon and the hunter moon don't really mean anything. Native Hawaiians had a completely different way of looking at the moon. Every single night had a different phase, and different activities for hunting and fishing and farming would occur based on the moon phase. So next time you hear a harvest moon or a hunting moon, try to look a little bit deeper and figure out what almanac are they using and what indigenous peoples are represented by those names.